not the land came first on Route 163, that still moved through the dark before sunrise, carrying their awe and their indifference. The land came first the way it always had. Copper-colored and cracked and smelling soupletsot and something older and Creus both, something that had no name in any language spoken by people still living. The Vane parcel occupied 847 acres, produced without of country, produced without apology, mesa floor dropping into arroyo, red sandstone slabs pushed finished with the planet in that particular corner and walked away. There were no trees here that had not already agreed to be small. There was no water that lingered. The wind did not visit. It lived here, moved through the collapsed east gate at dusk, with a sound like breathing that had simply never stopped. The house at the parcel's center had not been inhabited since 1974. That was the year Cordelia's great-uncle Rowan Vane had locked the front door, driven to Monticello, and checked himself into a motel room where he would die of a stroke 3 days later. No one knew why he left. No one in the family had ever asked with the genuine intention of finding out. They were the sort of people who preferred not knowing to the inconvenience of learning something that might cost them. Cordelia Vane stood at the property's outer edge, $2,001 sudden $8 remaining in a checking account that had once held considerably more, watching the darkness above the mesa lighten along its farthest edge. Not with hope. She had been careful with hope since the consulting firm had dissolved without warning in February, and the lease on her apartment in Salt Lake City had been graciously not renewed in March, and her ex-husband, Jet, had confirmed via it was empty, that the joint savings account she had not checked in 8 months was empty. She was past hope as a daily tool. The parcel, and had come to end, she had met durable. The parcel had come through the death of an aunt she had met 4 times. Della Vane. A woman remembered for her small, cold hands, and her habit had been divide-ins ended. She had died in November at 81, and her estate had been divided in December, and Cordelia's share had arrived in the form of a warranty deed for pay attention to the San Juan County, and a handwritten note clipped to it. Pay attention to the foundation. That was all. The house itself stood 200 yards ahead of her. In the grade firmed it herself. And a collapsed east wing that had gone down, and a crimest east sometime before 1990. The front wall leaned at an angle that suggested it was tired rather than broken. The roof had surrendered in sections. The 2 remaining windows on the upper floor were both somehow beckon. Somehow the smell reached her first. Heat that had never fully left the stone. Something mineral beneath that, pressed and ancient, and beneath even that, the faint, unmistakable scent of cedar wood that should not have survived this long. It meant something was sealed. She did not yet know what. She had driven 11 hours from Salt Lake. She had spent $43 on sandwich somewhere past Green River that she did not taste. She had 2,184. She owned 847 acres of rock and ruin and attention to the foundation. She began walking deliberately She began walking toward the house. The attention to the foundation. The will reading had taken place 6 weeks earlier in the offices of a Moab estate attorney named Creighton Farr, a man whose confidence in his own competence was expressed primarily through the quality of his leather chair. Cordelia had arrived from Salt Lake in the same coat she'd worn for the past 3 winters. She had parked 2 blocks away because the parking was free there. She had sat in the waiting room on a chair that was not as good as the attorney's and waited for the rest of the family to arrive. And they had arrived the way money arrives, with a sound before it enters the room. Harlan Vane was 47 and wore a watch that retailed for $18,600. She knew this because she had looked it up afterward, needing to understand something specific about the degree of her humiliation. He was not large, but he occupied space the way people who have never been told no tend to occupy it. Expansively, with the unconscious assumption that the world's square footage exists for their arrangement. He had brought his wife, Portia, who wore the kind of cashmere that does not pill, and who had not acknowledged Cordelia's presence in the room with anything more direct than the adjustment of her seated posture. The estate itself had been divided thus. Harlan received the family's Moab commercial properties, appraised at $2.3 million. A cousin in Denver received a cash bequest of $74,000. A charitable trust received $18,200. Cordelia received 847 acres in San Juan County. The warrant deed noting the main structure was of uncertain structural integrity, and a handwritten note from Delavane that the attorney read aloud with the tone of a man reading a grocery list. "Pay attention to the foundation." Harlan had laughed. Not loudly, he was too composed for that. A sound like air escaping something well-made. "Della always did love her little mysteries," he said, to no one in particular. He had turned to Cordelia, with the expression of someone performing generosity for an audience. "You could probably get $40 an acre for the grazing rights, if you find someone willing. I wouldn't bother with the structure. That wing came down in a windstorm in '89. The rest won't be far behind." He had said this quietly, pleasantly, with complete authority, as though he had already seen what her future would hold and found it negligible. Cordelia said nothing. She looked at the warranty deed in her hands. The paper was thicker than she expected. The county recorder's stamp, a faint embossed seal, was barely visible in the lower right corner, like a thumbprint left in clay. She ran her thumb across it without looking down. She could feel the raised impression, a surveyor's compass, small and precise, and beneath it a date. She did not look at the date in that room. She folded the deed in half and put it in her coat pocket. What she felt was not what Harlan expected her to feel. She felt, instead, the specific stillness of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped correcting the record. She felt the weight of the deed paper against her palm. She felt the possibility that she did not yet understand what she held. She left the office before Harlan had finished pouring himself a water from the carafe on the conference table. She drove east. She drove until the town was behind her and the mesa opened up. She pulled onto the shoulder of 163 and took the deed from her pocket and looked at it in the angled winter light. The date on the recorder's stamp was 1921. She sat with that for a long time. She had returned to Salt Lake and spent 3 weeks thinking before she drove back. In those 3 weeks, she had done 4 things. She had eaten carefully, spending no more than $11 per day. She had found a county property records archive, accessible online, through a University of Utah library. Login she still had from an 8-year-old graduate program she had never finished. She had requested every recorded instrument associated with the Vane parcel from 1910 to present, and she had received 43 pages of scanned documents that arrived in her email as a single unsorted file at 2 a.m. On a Thursday, the 43 pages told her several things. That the parcel had been originally acquired by a man named Ambrose Caldwell Vane in September 1921, recorded at the San Juan County Courthouse in Monticello. That a 1987 quitclaim deed appeared to transfer a significant portion of the mineral and subsurface rights to a holding company that had since dissolved. That no survey had ever been officially contested, and that the acreage figure in the original 1921 deed, 847 acres, was different from the acreage described in the 1987 quitclaim. 631 acres, 216 acres had on paper ceased to exist. She drove south on a Thursday in late March, carrying $831 in cash in her coat pocket and $1,353 in her checking account. She had packed 7 days of food into a crate: dried beans, canned fish, crackers, powdered coffee, a liter of water for every day. She had filled 2 additional 5-gallon jugs for the site. San Juan County in late March smells of wet clay and something sharper underneath. Alkali, the residue of ancient inland sea. The road into the parcel was 6 miles of washboard gravel off a county road that was itself 12 miles off Route 163. She drove slowly, because her car's front left strut had been making a sound since Thanksgiving that she had managed by never driving fast. The mesa stretched on both sides, enormous and indifferent, the sandstone formations rising in the distance like things that had decided to be permanent. She smelled the house before she saw it. Cedar wood, creosote, limestone that had dried and dried and dried for decades without ever being wet again. And beneath it, something she would not recognize until later. The particular cool exhale of sealed underground space meeting open air for the first time in a very long time. The house resolved from the early light in stages. First, the east wing's collapsed roof, its beams angled against the morning sky like the ribcage of something enormous. Then the main structure, 2 stories, thick-walled, built from the same sandstone that surrounded it, as though the house had been a function of the land, rather than something imposed on it. Then, the front porch, which had partially separated from the foundation. Then the door, still on its hinges, the lock a heavy iron fixture, black with oxidation. She got out of her car in the silence. The wind moved through the property from the northwest, and the creosote shuddered in it and went still. Something, a bird probably, moved in the collapsed east wing without showing itself. The morning was cold in the way Utah desert mornings are cold. Completely without apology, she almost didn't go inside, not from fear, from the weight of what it would mean if there was nothing there. She stood at the porch steps for a full 4 minutes, her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the door. Then she thought, $40 an acre for grazing rights. She thought, the compass stamp. She thought, 1921. She went up the steps. The 4th step cracked under her weight, but held. The door opened on the 2nd try, after she lifted it slightly on its hinges to clear the swollen frame. The smell that came out was a decade's worth of sealed air. Dust, cedar, mouse activity, old paper, and beneath all of it, coming from somewhere below, the same impossible cool exhale she had noticed from outside. Sealed space. Stone and sealed space and something that had been kept. She stood in the doorway and looked into the dark of the hall, and the house looked back. She worked for 6 days before she found it. The first 2 days were the house itself, room by room, 14 of them, ceiling height diminishing as she moved toward the back. The structure was sounder than it looked from outside. The walls were 2 feet thick in the original construction. Ambrose Vane had built in the style of a man who expected things to stand. She catalogued what she found. Stacked furniture under canvas, covers stiff with age, a kitchen range from sometime before 1940. Shelving units in the study lined with ledger books, their spines legible, dates running 1923 through 1971. 3 rooms on the 2nd floor that had been emptied deliberately, not abandoned. The absence was too organized, the dust undisturbed in the pattern of things removed rather than fallen. She slept in her car each night. She ate her canned fish and drank her powdered coffee and reviewed the 43 pages of scanned records with a flashlight, marking things, building a sequence. The foundation. Pay attention to the foundation. On the morning of the 3rd day, she began in the cellar. The cellar entrance was in the kitchen, a trapdoor set flush into the floor, its iron ring oxidized black, its hinges stiff with 40 years of disuse. She had to use the iron fire poker from the parlor fireplace as a lever to work it open. The wood of the door itself was heavier than it should have been. Not rot heavy, sealed heavy. She went down 8 steps into a space 6 feet tall and 30 feet in either direction. The smell hit her before she reached the bottom. Chalk and mineral oil and cedar and thyme. Her flashlight found stone walls, a hard-packed earth floor, and empty wooden shelving that had been installed with more care than anything in the rooms above. Nothing was here. That was clear in 15 minutes, but the floor was not uniform. She noticed it because she was looking at the floor. The habit of the last 3 days had made her look at surfaces, not spaces. The hard-pack earth was undisturbed in most of the cellar, a surface that showed age the way compressed things show age. Consistent, settled, permanent. Except in the northeast corner. There, the earth had a slight convexity, barely perceptible, the kind of differential a person walks over without registering. And the color was different. Darker. As though it had once been wet and dried separately. She pressed the toe of her boot against it. The ground gave slightly, not with the give of soft soil, with the give of something hollow beneath thin cover. She found a flat-bladed trowel in the tool shed behind the house and spent 40 minutes removing the surface. The earth came up in dry, clay-bound chunks. Beneath, at a depth of 9 inches, was the edge of a wooden platform, dense-grained hardwood, dark with linseed oil, tongue and groove fitted, no nails visible from above. She found the seam on the 4th side after 20 minutes of careful digging. The platform was 4 feet by 4 feet, set into the earth with a craftsmanship that had not aged at all. In the center of the near edge, nearly invisible under the staining, was a small iron ring bolt, countersunk into the wood. She pulled, it resisted. Not broken resisted, sealed resisted. The kind of resistance that meant something had been made airtight, and had stayed airtight for a very long time. She got the fire poker again, and used it as leverage. One end under the ring bolt, her knee against the adjacent wooden shelf for counterpressure. The seal broke with a sound like an exhale, like the house releasing something it had been holding in its chest since before she was born. Cold air, cedar oil, the faint, almost hallucinatory smell of old paper and something mineral. Lead, she would later understand. The space below was not a box, it was a chamber. Stone-lined, 2 feet deep, 3 feet wide, built from the same sandstone as the house above. Someone had lined every surface with thin sheets of copper that had gone green with age, but had preserved everything they touched perfectly. She lowered her flashlight into it. What she saw first were the tubes. 8 of them, lead-sealed cylinders the length of her forearm, capped at both ends with a rolled lip method she did not recognize, but would later learn was a surveyor's field seal, used before 1940. Beside them, a flat cedar box with a brass clasp. Beside that, a leather-bound ledger with a brass lock, the key taped to its cover with a strip of oilskin. She did not rush. She lifted the cedar box first. The clasp opened easily. Whoever had oiled it had done so within the last century, and the mechanism had not fought. Inside, on cotton batting that had yellowed to cream, was a single sealed envelope. The wax seal on the back bore the impression of a surveyor's compass. The letter inside was dated June 3rd, 1931. Written in a hand that was controlled and clear and very tired, to whoever owns this land after me. If you are a vain and you are honest, read carefully. If you are a vain and you are not, you will not understand what this means until it is too late for you to do anything about it. The survey in these tubes represents the true boundaries of this land as I walked them and paid for them and recorded them in September of 1921. The boundary on the eastern face runs to the old creek bed, not to the fence line my son constructed in 1928. The fence is wrong. The deed is right. The difference is 216 acres of plateau land directly above the second largest lithium-bearing formation in this region. I know what it is because I hired a geologist to tell me in 1929, and I paid him not to write it down. My son will try to sell it. I am hiding this so he cannot. When the right person comes, the right person will find it because the right person will be looking. I loved this land. I hope you will too. A.C. Vane, June 3rd, 1931. Cordelia sat on the cold stone floor of the cellar with the letter in her hands and did not move for 9 minutes. Outside, above her, the wind moved through the property. The east wing's beams settled. The creosote shuddered, and then she heard, from the direction of the gravel access road, the sound of a vehicle. She had the letter back in its envelope before she heard the car door. She put the envelope in her inner coat pocket. She closed the cedar box and returned it to the copper-lined chamber. She did not close the trapdoor. There was no time, and the sound of it might carry. She climbed the cellar steps and was standing in the kitchen when Harlan Vane walked through the front door without knocking. He was dressed for the sight. Carhartt jacket, good boots, the watch still on his wrist. He was not alone. A man she did not recognize came in behind him. Younger, carrying a briefcase, wearing a sport coat that was too thin for the morning cold. He had the look of someone who had been hired recently and was still uncertain about what, precisely, he had been hired for. Harlan looked at Cordelia for a long moment, in the way a person looks at a problem they expected to find exactly where it was. "Didn't think you'd still be here," he said. "I've been working," she said. He looked around the kitchen, at the cleared counter, at the flashlight she had left on the range. at the open trapdoor in the floor, with no visible awareness of what it meant. Then he looked at her. "I wanted to get here before you'd put any more time in." He said it the way people say things that are supposed to sound generous. "This property, there's a title question. Nothing that changes anything materially for you, but it affects the disposition of the mineral rights." The young man opened his briefcase and removed a document, which he set on the kitchen counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who has presented documents in uncomfortable locations before. It was 14 pages. On the cover sheet, the words "quitclaim deed" were printed in a font meant to signal authority. "This was executed in 1987, Harlan said. "Rowan signed over the subsurface and mineral rights to a family trust. That trust dissolved, and the rights reverted, as per the trust instrument, to the senior living vein in the direct line. That's me. You still have the surface. You still have the 847 acres above grade. But the subsurface, what's below 6 feet, that's been mine since 1987. He paused, with the consideration of a man who has rehearsed consideration. "There may be some lithium-bearing geology down there. We've had a survey done. Nothing confirmed, of course, but if it is confirmed, I wanted to get ahead of it. Legal is cleaner that way." The young man was looking at the open trapdoor. Cordelia did not look at the trapdoor. She kept her eyes on Harlan and felt, in her coat pocket, the weight of the envelope. "You'll want to have your own attorney look at it," Harlan said. This was the part he enjoyed. The offer of process that costs money she did not have, aimed at an outcome he had already arranged. "We can give you 30 days. That's kind," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was the word kind. He had expected something else. Anger, resignation. The particular flatness of a woman who has been told her winnings are being taken back. She looked at the quitclaim deed on the counter. She noted the 1987 execution date. She noted Rowan Vane's signature, familiar to her now from the ledger books in the study upstairs. She noted the description of the mineral parcel, 631 surface acres, with corresponding subsurface and mineral rights, 631 acres, not 847. "I'll need a few days to read this carefully," she said. "Of course." Harlan picked up the quitclaim deed and extended it to her. "Take your time." She took the document. She said, "I'll be in touch." He left the way he had come, through the front door, without looking back. The young man followed, briefcase reclosed, sport coat, inadequate against the cold. She listened to the car move back down the gravel road until she could not hear it. Then she went back down to the cellar and opened the lead-sealed tube that was marked, in a surveyor's tight hand, Eastern Boundary Survey Vein Parcels per 14-1921. She drove to Monticello the next morning. The San Juan County Recorder's Office was in a 2-story building on North Main Street that had survived several decades of county consolidation by being the kind of place where people who needed the original still had to show up in person. She arrived when it opened at 8. She carried the lead cylinder and the cedar box and the 14-page quitclaim deed. The county recorder was a woman named Theodosia Burke, who had held the position for 22 years and whose institutional memory for recorded instruments was, she said without modesty, comprehensive. Cordelia set the 1921 survey cylinder on the counter without preamble. She set the cedar box beside it. She set the quitclaim deed on top of that. She said, "I need someone who can read a 1921 field survey and tell me whether it supersedes a 1987 quitclaim under prior appropriation doctrine." Theodosia Burke looked at the survey cylinder for a moment. Then she looked at Cordelia. "Where did you find this?" "Under the foundation." The county recorder was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'll call David." David was the county assessor who arrived from 2 doors down with a coffee still in his hand and set it on the counter in the particular way of a man who has just been told something that has made him forget he was holding it. The survey unfurled onto the counter, and the 3 of them stood over it. It was drawn in ink on linen paper that had stayed perfectly flat inside the lead cylinder. A 1921 field survey of the vein parcel in Ambrose Caldwell Vane's commission, stamped and signed by a licensed Utah surveyor, whose license number was traceable in the state registry. and embossed in the lower right corner with the San Juan County Recorder's seal, in precisely the same compass rose pattern she had felt under her thumb. In Creighton Farr's conference room in December, the eastern boundary ran to the old creek bed. The survey notes described it in terms of landmark, bearing, and distance that the creek bed's modern geology still confirmed. The 1987 quitclaim deed described a parcel of 631 acres with mineral rights from the surface to unlimited depth. What it did not do, what it could not do, was describe the correct eastern boundary, because the boundary it used was the fence line Ambrose Vane's son had built in 1928, 7 years after the original survey. The fence line that was wrong. The fence line that Ambrose had known was wrong, and had spent 3 years in a sealed underground chamber protecting the proof of, under Utah's prior appropriation doctrine. Theodosia Burke explained with the calm efficiency of someone who has spent 22 years knowing exactly where things stand. An earlier recorded instrument governs in the case of a boundary conflict. The 1921 survey was in the county's own record. She found it within 8 minutes, buried in a ledger, the condition of which suggested it had not been opened in decades. It had been recorded. It had never been superseded. The 1987 quitclaim deed, Harlan's deed, the deed he had produced with his sport-coated attorney and his good boots and his $18,600 watch, described a parcel that did not legally exist. It purported to convey mineral rights to land that was not correctly bounded. The 216 acres of plateau land, including all subsurface mineral interests within it, had never been validly separated from the Vane parcel. It had always been Cordelia's. She called Harlan Vane from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring, with the tone of a man expecting a capitulation he had already written the terms for. She said, "I've been at the county recorder's office." A pause. "And I found the 1921 survey, the original. The eastern boundary runs to the creek bed." She paused one beat. "The quitclaim you presented describes a parcel that was never legally bounded. The 216 acres of plateau, including the lithium geology, has been part of this parcel since 1921. Silence. "You could get $40 an acre for the grazing rights," she said, "if you find someone willing." She used his exact words. She said them quietly, without pleasure or performance. She said them because they were precise, and because he would understand immediately what they meant. The silence on his end was the silence of a man realizing that contempt for paperwork is its own form of blindness. The same blindness that had let him inherit a lie and spend 30 years building on top of it. The county recorder filed the boundary dispute petition that afternoon. The Utah State Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining was notified. The lithium survey Harlan's own geologist had commissioned was now evidence against him. 3 news outlets in the region would carry the story within the week. The San Juan County Probate Court would issue a lease pendens on all mineral interests in the Vane parcel within 10 days. Harlan Vane's holding company, which had acquired a development option on the plateau land contingent on clear title, would be notified of the title dispute at the close of business on Thursday. Cordelia Vane walked back to her car in the parking lot on North Main Street and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Then she drove back to the parcel. Justice, in San Juan County, arrived in the way justice arrives in places that have never been in a hurry, methodically, without theater, in the language of county filings and surveyors' certifications, and the particular dry weight of legal instruments that have been a long time becoming what they are. Harlan Vane's contested mineral claim was invalidated by the Utah 3rd District Court 17 months later. The boundary determination was confirmed by a licensed survey conducted at the court's order, which agreed with the 1921 field survey to within 8 feet. The lithium-bearing formation in the 216-acre plateau parcel was confirmed by an independent geological assessment commissioned by the court and was described in the assessment as commercially significant. The valuation attached to that finding was $14.3 million at conservative extraction projection. The quitclaim deed executed in 1987 was found to have been prepared using a boundary description that did not correspond to any recorded survey, meaning it had been based on the incorrect fence line, knowingly or not, and had never been legally sound. Harlan's attorney filed a notice of appeal that was withdrawn 6 weeks later. Harlan Vane's development partnership, which had committed $870,000 to secure its option on the Plateau parcel, lost that investment entirely. His holding company reported a net loss in the following fiscal year's filing of $1.2 million. He sold the Moab commercial properties in a forced liquidation, 18 months after the district court decision. The watch was not mentioned in any public filing, but people who knew him reported he had stopped wearing it. Portia filed for separation the following spring. Cordelia Vane did not rush. She spent the first 8 months living on the parcel. In the house, she cleared and stabilized room by room with materials she purchased carefully, the way a woman purchases materials when she has learned to measure twice. She slept in the room that faced east, the one where the early light came first, the one from which she could see the plateau's edge against the dawn, and think, without hurry, about what had been kept there waiting for the right person. She named the foundation trust the Ambrose Vane Legacy Conservancy, and endowed it with $340,000 from the first mineral rights licensing agreement, which she structured with a Utah-based extraction firm, under terms that gave the Conservancy environmental oversight of every acre of the plateau surface. The remaining funds were split between a legal aid organization in Monticello that assists rural landowners with title disputes and a scholarship program at the University of Utah's Geology Department for first-generation students. The house at the parcel's center has 14 rooms again. The east wing was rebuilt in the second year, using the same sandstone quarried from the same formation as the original. The cedar door was rehung, the iron lock was rekeyed, the foundation vault was preserved exactly as she found it, the copper lining, the lead cylinders, the cedar box, the letter. She left the letter where Ambrose left it. There are still mornings when she stands at the eastern edge of the property, before the light is fully up, and the mesa has not yet decided what color it will be, and the wind moves through the creosote with the sound it always makes. The sound of a house breathing, the sound of land that has been patient for a very long time, and has simply been waiting for the person patient enough to deserve it. Some inheritances are not in the will. They are in the foundation. They are in the sealed place that only survives because someone thought ahead, because someone trusted that patience is not passivity, that silence is not surrender, that the thing you lay into the stone and seal against the air will be there when the right hands come looking. The land knew. It had always known. It simply waited for Cordelia Vane to arrive.